Imagine being asleep in your home when out of nowhere, FBI agents break down your front door, throw in flashbang grenades, and drag your family out at gunpoint, and then they realize that they actually hit the wrong home. Now imagine the government's response is not an apology. Instead, they argue that they had the discretion to do this very action and that they cannot be held accountable. This exact scenario already went all the way up to the United States Supreme Court, where the family won a 9-0 unanimous decision. But now there's another major development in this case. A federal appeals court has just issued a brand new ruling involving government immunity, and the family here is telling the 11th Circuit that this new ruling further proves why the FBI should not escape accountability for raiding the wrong home. But still, the government's response to all of this is that they cannot be held accountable. So let's break down what is now happening in this critical challenge. Now, before we jump into this video, if you want to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is simply by subscribing. You can also hit the like button that just tells the algorithm that you appreciate this content, and so it shares it with more people. So if you've been following the channel for a while, you will know that the Supreme Court recently issued a 9-0 unanimous decision in favor of the Martin family, who were victims of an FBI wrong house raid. So this all started because essentially back in 2017, FBI agents executed a pre-dawn raid in a suburban Atlanta area. Instead of going directly to the house on the warrant, one of the officers used his personal GPS device, I believe his iPhone, and the GPS he claims routed him to the wrong address. Instead of going to the address on the warrant, it took him to the home of Katrina Martin, where she lived with her boyfriend at the time and their 7-year-old son. So when the FBI agents arrived at the home, without warning, they smashed in the front door, detonated flashbang grenades inside the house. They pulled Katrina Martin and her boyfriend out of a closet where they were hiding with a shotgun, pulled out the 7-year-old son as well, handcuffed them, detained them, and all, while pointing guns at them and actually pulling out Katrina Martin while she was half naked. Now, after the agents had detained the family, they did a quick search of the home, and while performing that search, one of the agents noticed some mail on a coffee table and noticed that the mail address was different from the warrant. That's when they kind of realized that they had the wrong house, they raided the wrong home, and had this huge oh crap moment, we're at the wrong house. The officers then let them go, went to the correct home, told them that they would be back soon to explain, and they went about 3 homes down, actually, across a cross street, which was about a block away really, and executed the raid against the correct home. Now, in response to this incident, the family sued the government and the FBI. They brought a claim under the Federal Tort Claims Act, also known as the FTCA. In response to this lawsuit, the government claimed immunity under the discretionary function exception of the FTCA and asserted that the case must be thrown out. And ultimately, the lower court sided with the federal government and the DOJ. But then this case made its way all the way to the Supreme Court, who decided to step in, and ultimately they disagreed with the federal government. The Supreme Court made something very clear in their 9-0 unanimous ruling. You do not automatically get immunity just because law enforcement exercised judgment. The government has to show that those decisions were grounded in actual policy considerations, not just mistakes. Because of this, the Supreme Court sent the case back down to the 11th Circuit to reapply their analysis to take a fresh look at this case and also look at the correct standard. Recently, the 11th Circuit reheard arguments in this case following that Supreme Court directive and decision. And one thing repeatedly emerged during those oral arguments. They questioned where is the line between protected policy decisions and ordinary just outright mistakes and negligence. Throughout the hearing, the judges repeatedly pressed the federal government to explain how executing a warrant at the wrong house could possibly qualify as protected policy judgments. The panel appeared concerned that under the government's current theory, nearly any mistake made during a law enforcement operation could potentially be claimed to be a discretionary judgment and therefore shielded from liability. Several judges also pushed the government to explain how their current position was also consistent with what the Supreme Court just said in this ruling. The 11th Circuit is now also reviewing this case and is set to rule on this issue once again. But now we have another development because the Martin family has just filed a supplemental authority to the 11th Circuit, pointing to a new ruling that just came out of the 5th Circuit in a case called Morris versus the United States. And what's interesting is the Morris case deals with almost the exact issue that appears to be driving this Martin case forward. The question is whether government employees receive immunity when they negligently carry out an operation after making a discretionary decision. That distinction is very important for this case because nobody disputes that the law enforcement officers make discretionary decisions. The question is, what happens when they execute those decisions improperly? What happens when they make a mistake that borders on negligence? According to the Martin family's filing, the Fifth Circuit recognized that there is a major difference between a policy decision and the execution of that decision. The court explained that even if the government officials make a discretionary choice, they do not automatically receive immunity every time they make a mistake or any time that a mistake occurs afterwards. In other words, choosing a course of action may involve discretion, but botching the execution of that choice is something entirely different. And that's exactly where this Martin case currently lives. Now, importantly, the government is not simply conceding that the Morris case out of the Fifth Circuit just outright helps the Martin family. In fact, the DOJ is arguing that the Morris case is completely different and should be ignored. According to the federal government, Morris involved negligent execution after a policy decision had already been made. The government argues that the Martin case here is different because the decision being challenged here are intertwined with the law enforcement planning and operational judgment of executing a raid. And, this was all, tied together from the very beginning. In other words, the DOJ is still trying to frame what happened as part of a protected discretionary law enforcement operation, and that it needs to be looked at in unison. It can't just be piecemealed and looked at, one decision and then another. And they claim that if the courts start second guessing those type of decisions, then the DOJ argues it risks turning nearly every law enforcement operation into potential civil liability. And that's the government's main concern, and that's what they're trying to push the 11th Circuit to rule on. So the DOJ is urging the 11th Circuit to not read Morris as broadly as the Martin family, and ultimately they want the 11th Circuit here to reject that new Fifth Circuit ruling. Now, it's important to remember that the Morris case out of the Fifth Circuit is not binding on the 11th Circuit, so they do not have to 100% follow it. It is just simply persuasive authority. But it's also important to note that a lot of the legal concepts are very similar, and that's why the Martin family is pointing to it as persuasive evidence that they should win their case. So in this case, the Martin family already has a 9-0 unanimous ruling from the Supreme Court rejecting the government's broad immunity theory. The 11th Circuit judges appeared skeptical of several of the DOJ's arguments during those oral arguments, and now the plaintiffs have identified another federal appellate court ruling, reaching a conclusion that they claim supports their position. However, the DOJ argues that this case does not apply at all. It's not binding precedent, it's simply persuasive, and that the court here should simply reject it. So this case continues to move forward in a very interesting direction. The Supreme Court already issued a unanimous ruling in favor of the family. They ruled against the government's original position. The 11th Circuit has now reheard this case, and the Martin family has placed a brand new federal appellate court decision, before the 11th Circuit here, trying to also persuade that ruling that is now pending. The question now is whether the 11th Circuit agrees that there is a meaningful distinction between exercising discretion and negligently executing that type of decision. And ultimately, the question remains the very same in this case. Can the federal government claim immunity when agents raid the wrong house? And, is that type of wrong house or getting the wrong address or location, even though you have a warrant, is that some sort of discretionary function? So that's the latest update in the Martin versus US case. As soon as the 11th Circuit issues their ruling, or if there's more developments on this type of topic, I will let you guys know. If you like this video and you would like to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is simply to like, comment, and subscribe. All of those things help to fuel the algorithm and tells the algorithm that you appreciate this content, and so it shares it with more people. But as always, thank you so much for all of your support, and never forget this nation was built by armed scholars, and this nation will be maintained by armed scholars.